Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. I welcome you in the third lecture of year number 2, the silver lining, and I'm sure you must have watched previous two lectures carefully and would have been following the story with me. Before I resume the story from where we have stopped in the last lecture, let's have a quick recap of our story so far. Well, Mr. Nadeem, the narrator, came to stay in a guest house owned by Ahad. Mr. and Mrs. Ahad are very well-mannered and friendly people. They have a daughter, Mahi. Mahi is a deaf and dumb girl and suffering a lot due to her disability. Every time when a new visitor tried to be friendly with her, she became self-conscious. And this situation was very painful for her parents. Mr. Nadeem made a plan to help them. They wrote Mahin's problem on chits which were duly sealed and gave to every new visitor. Their plan worked well. But one day they had a strange visitor. It was late in the afternoon and I was talking to the landlord about some packed lunch that I needed the next day. I was planning a short excursion by myself to a group of caves nearby. The landlord was in a hurry, arranging things for a new guest who had booked a room for the season and was supposed to be moving in any moment, arriving by the mail train. Alright, there are a few words. Excursion, it means a short visit or trip. Mail train. Mail train, it's a fast train that carries mail. Well, dear students, the plan that Mr. Nadeem and Mr. and Mrs. Ahad had made was working well and everything was going fine. Meanwhile, one day, our narrator, Mr. Nadeem, planned to visit some caves by himself. He asked Mr. Ahad for the lunch that he required. Mr. Ahad was also busy in making arrangements for a new guest who was about to arrive. And sure enough, soon a young man came in with the porter carrying his luggage. He was barely 25, clad in an ill-fitting tweed suit with drooping shoulders and wide trouser bottoms. Because of the journey, he looked untidy. His hair, his necktie, his shoes, all unkempt and needing attention. But he had a cheerful face and jet black eyes sparkling with vitality. The words that I have marked: barely, it means hardly, only just. Clad, it means to be dressed into or wearing. Ill-fitting, ill-fitting of a garment means that it is of a wrong size for the person who's wearing. Tweed suit is a kind of suit that is made up of a rough woolen fabric. Drooping, bent, unkempt, shabby or messy. Vitality, life, energy. The new guest, who was a young man of hardly 25 years age, had arrived. A porter was carrying his luggage. That young man was wearing a woolen suit that was quite loose to him. As he had travelled so long, so he was looking untidy. Even then, his face had a smile and his eyes had a shine full of life. Mr. Ahad stepped forward and asked, "Mr. David, I presume?" The young man looked closely at his face, smiled and nodded. "Room number 18, please. Everything is ready." The young man again looked at him, smiled and nodded. He paid the porter, who bowed low, for he was not asked to return the change, and disappeared. The young man gave me a brief, friendly look and sat before a huge book, which the landlord had pushed before him, making the necessary entries about himself and his intended stay. Okay, there are just two words that I have highlighted. Presume. To presume something means to suppose or to assume. Intended. Something is intended when it is planned or intentional. After looking at the new guest, Mr. Ahad moved to him to confirm his name, which was Mr. David. That young boy smiled and moved his head in assent. Mr. Ahad told him his room number and that everything was ready for him. He, instead of saying something, again nodded. He gave money to the porter who had carried his luggage and did not ask him to return the remaining amount. So the porter became happy, bowed to show his thankfulness, and left. The young man started to write the details of his visit in a book that Mr. Ahad had given him. At this time he discovered the sealed envelope containing the typed chit lying on the table, addressed to him by name. He took the cover and tore it open. This coincided with the entry of the landlady into the room. She hurriedly asked her husband if this was the new guest, and having received confirmation, came forward and shook hands with the young man. "Did you have a nice journey, Mr. David?" she asked with her sweet smile. The young man smiled and nodded nonchalantly, as if to say, "Well, neither very pleasant nor very unpleasant." "Would you like to have hot bath immediately, or tea first?" The young man pursed his lips and shrugged his shoulders, obviously implying that one would be as good as the other, and that he had no preferences. Some difficult words coincided, it meant to happen at the same time. Nonchalantly, unexcitedly, or calmly, pursed his lips, to bring lips tightly together in a rounded form. Shrugged, raised, and contracted, imply, to indicate meaning. While he was writing about his stay, he saw an envelope that had his name on it. In that envelope there was a chit on which Mahin's situation was written. While he was opening it, Mrs. Ahad entered the room, and when her husband confirmed that he was their new guest, she welcomed him and asked if he had a nice journey. Mr. David, without saying any word, simply nodded to show that the journey was neither very good nor very bad. And when Mrs. Ahad asked him if he would like to have hot bath first or the tea, he didn't reply in words, but just moved his lips and shoulders to convey that he would like any of these two. Both the landlord and the landlady were by now slightly disconcerted by what they inferred to be their guest's pride and arrogance, since he had not even deigned to reply adequately to their polite inquiries. The young man meanwhile took out the typed chit and started reading it. As soon as he had gone through it, he looked around, astonished. The little girl Mahin was at the moment playing in the courtyard. We could see her sitting near the flower beds. The young man looked at all of us with a smile and darted out towards her. Disconcerted means confused, inferred, conclude or understand, deemed, thought fit to do something, adequately, to be satisfactory or acceptable, darted out, to move quickly out to something. When Mr. David didn't answer any of their questions properly, Mr. and Mrs. Ahad felt a little ashamed and confused. They thought that Mr. David was perhaps an arrogant man. Meanwhile, when he read that chit about Mahin, he started looking around and saw Mahin, who was in the courtyard. He at once went to her. Now this is very strange, Mrs. Ahad cried out in protest. How rude he is! He shouldn't have ignored our request like this, the landlord put in, more mildly. I too was a bit upset, for it was obvious that our effort to save Mahin's embarrassment from strangers was going to fail in this instance. After a few moments, we all walked out to the veranda, and I was apprehensive of that impending look of anguish on the faces of the parents and the child. The scene that confronted us was something we least expected. The strange young man was reclining on the grassy ground, and Mahin was sitting on his lap. He was showing her the flowers. Instance, it means case or occasion. Apprehensive, worried. Impending, about to happen. Confronted, to see or approach. Reclining, it means to lie back in a relaxed position. When Mr. David went straight to Mahin without considering Ahad's request to give her time, Mrs. Ahad got angry and called him a rude person. Mr. Ahad was also hurt because they were feeling that their efforts for Mahin would be failed at that moment. But when they went to the veranda, they were surprised to see the scene that was totally opposite to their expectations. Mr. David was sitting on the ground, Mahin was in his lap, and he was showing her flowers. And suddenly, like the sound of a gun exploding, the shrill animal-like laughter of Mahin pierced the air. The parents looked at each other with wonder and amazement. Our daughter has not laughed like this for years, Mrs. Ahad said. Curious, we watched the two of them who were now walking towards us hand in hand. Mahin ran to her mother and danced about her with joy. She made her queer sounds of "Mama, Mama," and wildly pointed to the young man. Pierce the air means forced through the air. Curious, eager to know. Queer, strange, unusual. While Mr. David was showing flowers to Mahin, she started laughing loudly. Her parents were surprised because she had never laughed like that before. Mahin and Mr. David came to them holding each other's hands. Mahin showed her happiness by dancing around her mother and pointed towards this new guest. Alright, I'll stop this lecture here, and in our next lecture we'll come to know how Mr. David brought joy to Ahad's by solving Mahin's problem permanently. I'll discuss some exercises with you, inshallah. Till then, take care of yourself and Allah Hafiz.